Okay, it's time for my February reading vlog. First up, we have The Lottery and Other Stories by Shirley Jackson. I've been meaning to read Shirley Jackson for a long time, but I've never got round to it. But recently a friend of mine recommended this short story collection, and so I thought, okay, I've got an Audible credit left, so let's get this book and let's see what all the fuss is about. And I'm really glad that I did, because I'm really enjoying this collection so far. The Lottery and Other Stories is surprising for me because the way I know Shirley Jackson is just through House of Haunted Hill, and so I always associate her with supernatural horror. But in this short story collection, there's nothing supernatural at all, at least not in the stories that I've read so far. Instead, Jackson is trying to find the horror and creepiness in ordinary, almost mundane things. And I think she does this really well, and in some ways it's even more effective than horror that might be a little bit more gory and graphic. In one of my favourite stories so far, The Demon Lover, we have a typical story of a woman who's on her wedding day, she wakes up, she's going to get married, she's going to find the guy that she's getting married to, and she discovers that he has vanished. And the short story follows her as she goes about the town asking people where he is, and everyone seems to gaslight her into thinking that this guy doesn't exist. And there's a great sort of creepiness to this as she's going around, because not only are the people gaslighting her, but they're also whispering about her and laughing at her and mocking her, or at least she thinks that they are. And Jackson does a really good job of making this very ambiguous. It's not clear as a reader whether people are gossiping and laughing at this girl, or whether it's in her head because she feels so humiliated by what's going on. And that just makes the entire thing that little bit extra creepy and surreal. Another great one from the collection so far is one called Trial by Combat, which is about a woman who moves into this new block of flats, and she discovers that some of her things have gone missing. She finds out that the culprit for this stuff is this really nice, doddery woman who seems to maybe forget that she's stealing them, or is just so confident in her stealing them that she'll just walk around the building displaying the things that she's nicked. It's a very weird story, and again, it's hard to talk about too much of it because it's so short, so I'd basically just be telling the whole story if I said any more. But it really does a good job of treading the line between horror and absurdism, which is hard to do because usually you can't do absurdism and scary at the same time, but Jackson manages to do it pretty well here. I've only read the first 3 or 4 short stories in this one though, but I'm definitely looking forward to carrying on with this, and I think it will definitely be something that I talk about in a full video on the channel soon. The next book takes us actually into the absurdist genre, and that is Froth on the Daydream by Boris Vian. This is a French novel, and the translation that I have actually isn't called Froth on the Daydream, it's called Mood Indigo, and I think there's another English translation with a different title, so if you want to go find this book, be aware that the title might not be the one that I said it is. In Mood Indigo, we follow a young man called Colin, who is a hedonist and he's incredibly wealthy, but he feels like his life is empty because he doesn't have anyone to love him. He then enters this whirlwind romance with a young woman called Chloe. They get married, and then she gets a disease where there's a water lily inside her lung, and it's basically a metaphor for cancer, and their fates start to go downhill after this point. There's also a side plot with a young man called Chick, who is Colin's best friend, and Chick has an obsession with a philosopher called Jean-Paul Sartre, which is a pun on the actual French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. Now in the story, Colin, in order to pay for his wife's treatment, begins to squander, well not squander, but spend all of his money on her treatment, and Chick, in order to maintain his obsession with buying everything that Jean-Paul Sartre has written, begins to squander all of his money on the collected works of Jean-Paul Sartre, ruining his relationship with a young woman called Alison. Now the first 2/3 of this book are incredibly funny and silly. Even the lung disease with the flower is portrayed in a very humorous and silly way, because it's an absurdist story. Now I was enjoying the first 2/3, but I was having the problem that I have with a load of absurdism, which is, because of the absurdism, I find it very difficult to connect in an emotional way with the characters or with the story itself. Because things are so weird and abstract, it doesn't come across as particularly real, and so it's more like a dream than an actual story taking place. What really surprised me and blew me away with this story was how in the 3rd act, Vian keeps the absurdism, but manages to go to some really dark and tragic places, and by the end of the story, I really did connect with it emotionally. Now without that 3rd act, I think this would have been a solid book and I would have enjoyed it, but it wouldn't be a book that I would have maybe wanted to come back to again. But after seeing where that story goes at the end, I definitely want to read this again, and I would recommend it to anyone out there who maybe doesn't like absurdism for the reason that I said about it being hard to connect emotionally. If you want to read an absurdist book that does hit you on an emotional level, then definitely give this book a go. Next up, we have the 7th book in the Wheel of Time series, A Crown of Swords. The Wheel of Time is definitely a difficult series to read. I enjoy it a lot. I think it's one of the best fantasy series out there, but by God, are books 7 to 10 a bit of a pain to get through. I'm on my second read through of the series, and I'm listening to them on audiobooks this time, and I'm finding that is a lot better than when reading them as physical texts. That being said, A Crown of Swords was, when I first read the series, the first book where I contemplated stopping with the series, just because I wasn't hating it so much, but I read several books at any one time, and so when I'm choosing a book to read, I'll usually pick the one that's most interesting at the moment. And I felt like in this book, things were being dragged out so much. Events in the story that could have been dealt with in a chapter or less were being drawn out over several chapters. And so when I was in one of these sloggy bits, I just didn't want to return to the book. I wanted to read a more interesting book, which was quite easy to do because this book is quite hard to get through. And my thoughts haven't really changed on the second read through. I still think that those flaws are there. What I will say is listening to it in audiobook does help quite a lot, partly because you can speed it up, but also I just think it's more engaging to read the text when you have someone speaking it to you. I don't really want to say that much more about book 7 because I will review it on the channel, but one thing that I will say, because this has been quite negative, is that I do think The Wheel of Time is a fantastic series, and while there are a couple of books that are not the best things in the world, they are worth getting through. There are still some great moments in this book and in the other books in the slog, so it's certainly not a reason not to read the series. It's just one of the weaker books, at least in my opinion. Alright, next we are moving on to some poetry. I decided to carry on reading poetry, even though my experience with Lord Byron last month wasn't the best. I will go back to Byron at a later date because I do want to read some of his other work, but this month I decided to give that a break and read Emily Bronté's collected poems. Now, most of Bronté's poems are not things that she published in her lifetime, and most of the poems, I don't think all of them, but certainly most of them, are told in a fantasy world called Gondal that she created with her sister Anne. This makes the poems really interesting because you don't have the complete works from Gondal, and so instead you just have various poems that give you some events, maybe a battle or a death of a character or a relationship, or even just someone singing a song in that world. And these are all just collected fragments of this world. Reading them is almost like you're an archaeologist, you found some text from an ancient civilization that tells you about the history of this world, but it's not complete, and so you have to fill in the blanks for yourself. And that was a really interesting reading experience. Obviously it wasn't intended by Emily Bronté herself, but it is nonetheless really interesting to see that and to try and work out how these things are fitting together. But outside of that, the poems are also just interesting in their own right. Bronté touches on some timeless themes, mainly death, nature, and isolation. And a lot of her poems, surprisingly, are about war and conquering nations. It actually surprised me how many of the poems are told from a male or even masculine perspective. And for me that's really interesting because I tend to prefer writers who are really good at flipping genders around, and so when I get a female writer who can write a male perspective really well, I enjoy that more than say a male that can do it, because I think it shows an extra ability on the writer if they can connect with a perspective that isn't necessarily their own perspective. And I think Emily Bronté is really good at doing both masculine and feminine voices in her work. If I was to criticise the collection for anything, it would be that the poems are somewhat similar. All of them kind of focus on very similar themes, and that can get repetitive as you go through it. That being said, it does make sense that the poems would be vaguely similar because they are all set in the same world, and I do think that Bronté does enough variations within her main themes to keep things interesting throughout the whole work. I'd recommend, if you want to read these poems, try reading them out loud or even listening to an audiobook version of it. I read them aloud myself, and I think that just helped me appreciate how beautiful the language that Bronté uses is. She really is good at not just rhyming things well, but putting words together in a way that sounds really nice to say, and it just adds an extra richness to the language if you read them out loud. And now, the last thing that I read this month, carrying on with my Shakespeare reading challenge, was Antony and Cleopatra. Antony and Cleopatra reminds me a little bit of Romeo and Juliet in that you have this tragic romance that centres the whole plot, but unlike Romeo and Juliet, which is a bit kind of namby-pamby and wishy-washy and weepy, Antony and Cleopatra is much more bloody and brutal and a little bit more confusing. the relationship between Antony and Cleopatra is certainly way more complex than that of the relationship between Romeo and Juliet. It's pretty clear with Romeo and Juliet that it's love at first sight, it's very passionate and somewhat naive, whereas with Antony and Cleopatra, they have a very confusing romance, and there's debate about whether they actually do love each other. Now, a lot of this boils down to the character of Cleopatra, who seems to be one of the most polarizing Shakespeare characters, but is certainly one of my favourites. What makes Cleopatra so polarizing is that she's really hard to come to grips with. She can go from being this sensual and calm woman to being this really cold-blooded and cruel woman. In one scene, she has a servant almost killed just because he tells her a piece of news that she doesn't like. And there are other scenes where she'll just go from, 0 to a million in terms of temper within the space of a few sentences. I sometimes wonder if what makes Cleopatra work as a character, at least if you've only ever seen it on stage, is how good the actress is, and I do think that it is probably quite difficult to play that character well. I think there's definitely a risk with Cleopatra as a character that she could come across as being quite shrewish and loud and obnoxious if you didn't play her quite right. But when I read the text, I found there's actually a lot more complexity to her character in the text. And so I think if you read the text rather than watching a play, you might be able to pick up on some of those nuances a little bit more and come to grips with her character. Because she's a lot more than just this passionate, loud, aggressive woman. She's also quite soft, she's also very clever, there's just so much richness there, and for me I think she's one of Shakespeare's best characters. In fact, I would say she reminds me a little bit of Catherine Earnshaw from Wuthering Heights, so if you have read Wuthering Heights and you like Catherine Earnshaw, not necessarily like her because you think she's a good person, but if you enjoy those kinds of characters, you might find a lot to like in Cleopatra. It's definitely a play I would recommend because I do feel like it does get overlooked in comparison to some of Shakespeare's better known tragedies. So if you haven't read it, give it a try. And if you have read it, let me know what you think. And do you think that Cleopatra is just a very difficult character to pull off well because she's so complex and all over the place in terms of how she acts in different situations? Alright, that's it for the vlog. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like, and also don't forget to subscribe to the channel. I upload new videos every Monday at 4 PM. Also, I am working on a new series of videos as well, so pretty soon I will be having 2 uploads a week as well, but I will announce that series a little closer to the time once I've finished editing the videos for it. But that's it for this video, so take care everyone, I'll see you all next time.